So I want to bring on Chris Burnett. Chris, good morning. Welcome to the show.
Good morning, Jan. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you. And I, first of all, want to acknowledge that you're a military veteran, you're a Marine veteran, JAG officer, retired recently, right? Four months out or something, right?
That's exactly right. I retired after 22 years on active duty in February of this year. And across those 22 years, I had a chance to deploy to Iraq and the Middle East over 5 times.
Wow. Well, we're going to talk about that in the second half and your background and experience, and we'll touch on Iran and Israel. But I just want to, first of all, thank you for your service. This is a day and time that we remember. Our independence didn't come without a cost, and many people along the decades have paid the price, and not only maybe with their lives, but with a lot of things affect somebody after they've deployed, and you know better than anybody, and I'll have you share about that. So first of all, we were talking about education, so let's finish up there. What are your thoughts about University of Penn and what they've finally done to right the ship?
Well, as you know, I'm running for Maryland's 6th congressional district as I step away from active duty. And I see this effort as an extension of my service, selfless service to set the conditions for other people to succeed. And this issue in particular hits very close to home. I have 3 daughters, all of whom are athletes. I have a junior who's a rising senior. She's going to be competing as a gymnast at Ohio State after she graduates. And then I have 2 little ones, an 8-year-old and a 6-year-old, and they both compete in gymnastics, swimming, and a few other sports. So, as this issue was emerging and as it was evolving across time, I was particularly interested in opportunities for my daughters, the safety of my daughters, and I was very concerned that we were moving in the wrong direction. We were basically creating an opportunity for very small number of individuals at the expense of an enormous number of individuals who've been fighting for this opportunity their entire lives.
Well, I think your point is well made that DEI, and it's now people are finally finding the courage, frankly, to say it was a discriminatory practice.
Yes.
And so, we listen, we all want human beings to be happy. I have very strong feelings, having worked in social services and around child protective services. I've looked them in the eyeball. I know their stories. It's a pretty horrific thing. But when you have somebody who's being manipulated and deceived into believing that how they were made is not okay, we're into some deep psychological issues that we just weren't willing to call it that because we were afraid to offend. But so the whole transgender movement has been incredibly detrimental to the future of many, many millions of children and youth athletes, like you mentioned. So we have to get that right, and we're getting it right. And thank God for SCOTUS. The decision on Friday last week, Mahmoud v. Taylor. What do you want to say about that? That, they restored parental rights. They said, we get to say whether our child is going to be exposed to XYZ. We have a say in what's best for our children. What are your thoughts about that?
I appreciate the question. As a father of 4, all of whom attend Montgomery County Public Schools, and as a lawyer, I thought this was a victory for parental rights and free exercise of religion. The case law clearly supported this outcome, and this was absolutely DEI overreach. The public school, they failed to meet the requirement in order to have a policy that was going to take away a choice from a parent. They basically said it was too hard, so we're going to take away your choice. We know better. And it was great to hear that the Supreme Court sided with parents, sided with the Constitution, and we got the right outcome.
Yeah, that was shocking when I read that. And I think we discussed it previously, but it's, when they said, well, it just became cumbersome, right? It became difficult to implement. Oh, well, that's your job, get over it. So, as my father would say. So, I think you're right. We finally got it right. This was an important decision. And I suspect there are more coming, particularly around the discriminatory practices. What are your thoughts in terms of, as a lawyer, where we stand in the educational system and shifting it? You're running for Congress. You're going to be seated in Congress, hopefully one day. You will have the opportunity to weigh in on, make decisions, vote accordingly to to restructure education away from the federal system into the hands of the state, which I think most people believe that's where it belongs. What are your thoughts about that, and how would you weigh in on that as a member of Congress?
Well, first, I will always stand with parents. This is not a complicated issue. I think the fact that we have somehow moved away from the interests and rights of a parent is shocking. So, as I would evaluate legislation or look at policies, I would start with parental rights. Then I would look at what is the educational benefit of what we're doing. And if it's simply inclusivity, so that some people could feel better about their current circumstances, well, then I would want to know what the educational purpose of that is. Because at the end of the day, all we should be concerned about is preparing our children to compete in a hyper competitive environment. They need to focus on learning and not indoctrination.
Absolutely. And I think, and I've said this long before COVID hit, when we were having all the fentanyl and overdoses, we were tracking. I was working very closely with Sheriff Jenkins here in Frederick County. We were on air regularly talking about the overdoses and the fentanyl. And I declared at that time, would have been what, 2017, 2018, we have a mental health crisis in America. So then COVID comes and it just amps that up. And then you have young kids who are shuttered in their homes. My son was deeply, profoundly affected by the lack of socialization and the horrible decisions that were made around COVID that affected our young ones. And it became very clear that the psychological impact on an already troubled population in some cases just escalated out of control. And then now they're vulnerable to transgenderism and, you're not okay the way you are. And all of these conversations that were just an assault on their individuality and personality. What are your thoughts about that?
Wait, again, this is an interesting question given my personal experience with this. So, when I was on active duty, you travel and move every 2 to 3 years. So, my last duty assignment before I moved to Montgomery County was in Florida. So I was at United States Southern Command, and then out of there, I had a chance to go to a top level school, and then I deployed in support of CJTF OIR, or that was the counter ISIS mission. But during that time, while I was finishing up school and then getting ready to deploy, is whenever COVID hit. And Florida had a very different approach. All of my children were temporarily at home, and a lot of their activities were suspended. But as you know, Florida came back online very quickly. So while I was deployed, I would get updates from my wife, and she would say, the kids are doing great. They're back into all their activities. They're back at school. They're back playing sports again. And so by the time I returned from that deployment, things in Florida had returned to normal. And this is 2021. At that time, I had orders to the Pentagon. And as we were getting ready to move, we were looking at houses and looking at my commute to the Pentagon, my commute to Fort Meade, and we landed in Montgomery County. And quite frankly, we were shocked by what we encountered. We went from what was common sense solutions, prioritizing the well-being of kids and their education, to now being in the middle of this kind of culture war issue about masks and who's going to go to school and how we're going to evaluate eligibility and who's at risk and how we're going to try to really put everybody's interest ahead of our children's well-being. And I think not only has this had a catastrophic effect on our educational well-being, I think the psychological and mental health impact is still being measured. And I think it had an enormously negative impact on our children.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And that's very interesting to show the juxtaposition in your real life on Florida to Maryland. Of course, so many of my friends went to Florida because they couldn't take it anymore. We're in a precarious situation right now. You and I have both met John Myrick, who's running for governor. I'm a supporter of John Myrick for governor. I don't know who else is jumping in the race, but he's got what I think we need, which is a common sense approach to Maryland. How will you work as a congressional member to support Maryland, frankly, in getting away from these left liberal psychotic decisions they're making out of Annapolis. We have our own cabal down there, and these people have been installed for years. I am a firm believer that we do not have free and fair elections in Maryland. I have seen the data. I know the information. I've talked to the engineer experts. We know that's the case. The question is, can we unravel that ball of yarn?
I think we can, and it starts with winning elections. First of all, I think John is a great guy. I really wish him the best of luck, and he has my full support. He and Brenda represent really the best of us. She's a lifelong educator, a PhD in education, and he's a public servant. Much like myself, he sees running for governor as an extension of his service. The selfless approach to setting the conditions for other people to succeed, which is exactly why, as I came off active duty, I couldn't think of a better thing to do than to jump into this race and try to shift the narrative, which gets to your question. How do we lead from a state level and a congressional level? Well, you run an election to win. This idea that we're going to raise issues to make the other side look bad, only to make them look bad and lose, is not helpful. We need to win elections. And so first, we shift the narrative and we have an expectation of winning, and we run campaigns to win. And then once you have a seat at the table and you're able to negotiate, and I'm able to work with the speaker and I'm able to work with the Trump administration, we now actually have a voice in what's moving through Congress and what's making its way to the president. Right now, we have no voice whatsoever. Do-nothing Delaney has not only done absolutely nothing for CD6, she's not representing the interests of Democrats or Republicans. As a representative for CD6, I would fight for the individuals who live here and for their interests. As a resident of CD6, I'm living their experience. Every single day, I feel the pain that every resident in Western Maryland feels, and that's too much taxes, too much regulation, and not enough opportunity. I think John at the helm as governor would make a major shift in the priorities in Annapolis and his ability to work both with Congress and the Trump administration to filter opportunity and to reset expectations in Maryland around common sense solutions, balanced budgets, and education first.
Wonderful. Well, you both are military veterans, and I think it's inspiring across the country to see so many veterans running for office, men and women alike, stepping in and saying, we're going to continue our service in public service. And it is a very different mentality than a politician. It's a very different mindset, and I've witnessed it firsthand from both sides. And I've been a politician, quite frankly. I ran for office, but I come from the place of making a difference and being of service, and bringing a level of integrity to it where you're willing to say, I'm not willing to go that far. I'm not willing to compromise myself to win. And so there's this balance. Yeah, you got to be in it to win it. That's it. There is no coming in second. And by the way, Delaney is just married the right guy, right? Okay. So she brings zero to the table. You bring so much to the table, as does John. I want to ask you a couple of questions. One, would you concede if you lost, if you felt there was not a free and fair election, and indeed they had cheated?
Well, first, as a lawyer and as a Marine Corps officer, accountability and integrity are at the forefront. Everything that I will do will be transparent. Everything that I will do, I will make myself accountable to the voters, and I will make myself accountable to this process. If there is any indication whatsoever that votes were not counted or that voices in Western Maryland were not heard, absolutely not. It's a disservice to those folks that have supported you, and it's a disservice to this process. But like I said, as a Marine Corps officer and as a lawyer, that would be driven by data and facts. And I would look very closely at that. And if I found that there was fraud, or if there was somebody's voice had not been heard, then I will fight to the very end to ensure that every single vote counts in Western Maryland.
That's great. And you are seeing a weighting also where you're having 1.3 votes or whatever. So that speaks to the fact that you have corruption, because you can't have 1.3 votes. That's just not, as my father would say, it's a non-think. So in the realm of, you have a vote, you count the vote. And one of his frustrations as the lawyer who's filed a lawsuit, which is now before the Supreme Court, is that they have not counted votes. They've been manufacturing, manipulating it, and maneuvering. How do you feel about term limits, given that you're a public servant and you want to do this for the people and it's an extension of your service? Then how does that comport with term limits?
Well, what's interesting is in free and fair elections, the ultimate check on a term should be with the voters. Voters can, at any moment, as you come up for election, vote you out. However, in our current climate, I would certainly entertain term limits so that we can constantly be bringing in new voices, new energy, and essentially introducing a new generation of leaders to our federal requirements, whether it's in the Senate or in Congress. So I haven't seen a viable piece of legislation, but like anything else, I would look at it in terms of its viability. Is this going to move the needle forward so that more voices are heard and that more action can be taken to solve problems rather than just kick the can down the road, which is what I think a lot of career politicians have done. They've made careers out of doing nothing and pointing a finger. If they knew they only had a limited amount of a time to address problems, now their focus changes from how do I maximize and lengthen my tenure to how do I solve problems while I'm here? How will my legacy be viewed as somebody who did more for my district than anyone before me because I had a finite amount of time and I had a purpose for being there? My sole goal in running for Congress and being a congressman is to set the conditions for other people to succeed. That was my function as a Marine Corps officer. It's something I've embraced as a lawyer. It's certainly something I'm trying to pursue as a father. Every single day, decisions that I make are intended to help other people to succeed. I'm going to bring that exact same approach to Congress. And if that includes voting for term limits, then I would certainly take a very close look at whether or not we would be hurting or helping citizens and the residents of CD6. If it's something that's going to help them, I will absolutely support it.
So one of the one of my beliefs, I don't know if it's a standard belief, but it is mine, that the term limits will also inhibit the ability for career politicians to be so entrenched and indoctrinated into a system that they can't break out of. They can't step out and vote their conscience because they've done this or they owe this and they somebody knows this. So I think term limits would ensure less corruption at the federal level. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I agree. I think, the way I interpret history is I think the founding fathers looked at going to Congress, going to Washington as an extension of their public service. In other words, they didn't view politics as a career. These were statesmen. These were individuals that were successful in everything that they did. They would take a break from their successful private lives and do public service. And I feel like we've lost that along the way. We've created this urgency around a level of expertise that is not really helpful anymore. Like you had just said, you have people that are in place for 20, 30, or 40 years, and they seem that they are now up, they are the institution. And without them, the institution would fail. Well, that's a problem in and of itself. So I would take a very close look at how we can better align ourselves to that selfless service that our founding fathers intended. And that is you do your best to help others to succeed, because in helping them to succeed, you're bringing up everybody, not just bringing the success you had, but most importantly, setting the conditions whoever comes here to have those same opportunities.
Well, I think that sounds like a value that you bring from the Marine Corps because, you're in it together, right? When you're out there in the field doing what you do. And we've been talking about term limits. I want to shift over to some of the things that are happening at the federal level. We just had the one big, beautiful bill issue that's been, somewhat controversial between conservatives, fiscal conservatives. We know about Elon Musk. He got frustrated and left. It was time for him anyway, because he needed to, frankly, I feel bad for what he endured and his company has endured when they attacked him. It was just ridiculous. So, I get it. I don't fault him at all. And, I've said it before, we're in a war right now to save our country in this bureaucratic nightmare that we're in. And so, tensions can fly high. We can get a little tense because there's a lot at stake here. just recently, FBI announced, Cash Patel, Director Patel, just announced that that they are moving the FBI headquarters to the Ronald Reagan building. It'll increase their space a little bit. Some people are frustrated because they're saying, wait, I thought you were shutting the place down because it's so corrupt. So a lot of stuff going on over there, and I'm sure they're cleaning house, and some of it's personnel issues they can't discuss, right? It's a personnel matter. But when you look at some of the corruption, Dr. Oz just announced that Medicare and Medicaid is being overhauled and scrutinized. They discovered corruption that has an international influence in it. International companies coming in and basically robbing taxpayers of Medicaid dollars. So, what will you do, Chris, to address this corporate collective governmental corruption that has been frankly driving up our deficit? We're at what, 32, 37 trillion, I think it is now. So, we're saying, wait, one big beautiful bill should be dropping our pricing and our deficit, not driving it. So even Republicans have been at odds on this. What are your thoughts?
Well, first, I mean, these are complex issues and these are enormous numbers. But the fact is, they really distill down to some very simple solutions. Like I've learned in the Marine Corps and what I've applied across my entire life is there's accountability and there's integrity. Any opportunity that I will have to investigate, to review policy, or to review legislation, the first thing I will look for is this a good use of tax dollar money? Are we, in fact, good stewards of other people's money? I don't think people realize that this is not an unlimited pot of money, that we have a responsibility to every single taxpayer to make sure that every single dollar is accounted for. There were times when I worked in the Pentagon where they would talk about $1 billion or as 100 as a rounding error. And it was oftentimes a joke because these numbers were so big. But again, it's a very simple concept. Are we holding ourselves accountable? Are we honest brokers of other people's money? And are we using that money to the benefit of the American people? So I would, first of all, run this campaign and approach my time as a congressman focused on accountability and integrity, looking to optimize service, to optimize our review of contracts and performance, and then to look to extend that in and to codify that. I think that the work that was done by Elon Musk was invaluable because it exposed that there is a lot of room here where people haven't been holding themselves accountable, and this hasn't been an honest practice. And I would want to build on the spirit of that to ensure that people don't view government employment as an entitlement. People don't have the attitude that as long as I show up, I can't be fired. As long as we're trying to do the right thing, well, that's enough. The answer is we got to do better, not only in terms of our performance, but in our execution of contracts. And then the intent of those things is, are we in fact moving the ball forward for the American people? So I would absolutely support anything that's going to increase accountability, that's going to be based on integrity, and ultimately create more opportunity for the American public with their tax dollars.
Excellent. Well, I think that's what people want. So that makes you a good candidate. And, I hope that people will consider Chris Burnett for Congress. Certainly, what's in Congress in Maryland's 6th congressional district does not represent the will of the people. And so that must be restored. I wanted to ask you about rebuilding military. Given the wasteful spending, USAID was the most egregious, paying for condoms in some third world country. I mean, it's just not our purview. So and it's an abuse of tax dollars. And trust. I mean, we've lost our trust in our public officials, and it just is unacceptable. Shifting to military and ultimately to Iran, I want to talk about that. What is your thought about building up our military readiness? We went through an onslaught of attacks with the COVID shot requirements. A lot of people opted out. Some people took it. It affected their health. We've had an increase, I believe, in cancers off the charts with military staff. So, what are you going to do to protect and defend our nation with the best use of our dollars, but also making sure that our troops are safe?
Well, and that's going to be an absolute priority. Having just come off active duty and having spent some of the best years of my life with some of the best and brightest our country has to offer on the ground in Iraq, in Kuwait, and on board the USS Boxer as a part of a Marine Expeditionary Unit, the people in our military are by far our greatest asset. And what I think you had mentioned earlier is the deployment is more than just what you experience on the ground. That is a stressful experience for the family, for the kids. It is a difficult environment for families to thrive. And I think we have to account for what we did over the last 20 years, which was we asked a lot of our people. We used up our equipment in a way that we were not able to sustain, and we found ourselves ill-equipped for the next fight. So I would prioritize one, taking care of our people, ensuring that they have the training that they need and the resources to support their family and to be able to thrive as they shift from duty station to duty station and deploy overseas. Then the second part of that would be to ensure that the budget reflects the needs of the operator. What I mean by that is at times we got somewhat distracted by DEI initiatives. We were having young Marines and young service members sitting through training that was more of a check in the box, hey, we're going to do a little bit of social engineering here, than focusing on the equipment they needed for warfighting. So focusing on the individuals, focusing on the training and equipment that's for warfighting, and then most importantly, taking care of our veterans. As I transitioned out of the military, I realized that we have taken tremendous strides to help veterans, but I still see people struggling. They have lost that sense of their purpose and identity, and they struggle to find employment. They struggle with mental health, and they struggle with physical ailments that were the result of their service. So we've got to take care of our active duty service members. We have to ensure that the budget reflects the actual needs of our men and women in uniform and ultimately protect our veterans.
Brilliant. I'm so grateful that you said that because my heart hurts for the damage that's been done in a forever war. And thank God President Trump said, we're not doing this anymore. When Biden got in and he gave away what, $80 billion in equipment. How did you feel about that? You were still in.
Yes, and I think a lot of service members felt betrayed. I think they felt like what they had fought for was just sort of thrown away, that the utility of their sacrifice and the utility of the things they had done was no longer relevant. So we just moved on in the most politically expedient and perhaps most ridiculous way, which was to leave equipment behind and to leave behind a lot of blood, sweat, and tears that service members had invested over the course of 20 years.
Yeah, that was a horrible, horrible day. Um, let's shift to Iran. One of the things I believe, Chris, is that people who serve in Congress, regardless of their jurisdiction, yes, you want to bring dollars back to your district. I get that, right? I wish you'd fix 270 and 15. It's a nightmare. But all that being said, your voice and your talent and your expertise in Congress will help people in Ohio, in Florida, Kansas, wherever. So it's really important that we as a nation are choosing wisely across states to make sure that we have the best and brightest in Congress serving us. And I think that's been part of the problem with the approval ratings of Congress, because frankly, it's been, I'm going to say jerry-rigged a bit. We saw it in your district. CD6 was, a manipulated district for a long, long time. So now they've gotten it right because Supreme Court weighed in, and now we can hopefully have proper representation in the event we have free and fair elections. I want to talk about Iran, Israel, President Donald J. Trump's leadership, and first of all, I want to ask you, what was it like with him as commander in chief when you were in?
That's a great question. I was on the ground two different ways. So I was on the ground in Kuwait under the tail end of Trump first time around, and then I also saw a little bit of the Biden administration, and it was amazing to see how whenever Trump was in the seat, things were getting done, and they were getting done in the way that military operators needed it done. So as you're doing military planning, you're always looking at risk to mission, risk to force, and mission accomplishment. And over the years, across 5 different deployments, And different presidents from President Bush, Obama, and Trump, and then Biden, there were varying degrees of risk that people on the ground, service members on the ground, would have to absorb, usually for political points. And what I found under President Trump is that he would ask what was needed. How do we do this the right way? And we executed. And that was appreciated across the force. I can't speak for anyone else but myself, but I can tell you what I experienced and what I observed was decisiveness, leadership, and focusing on mission accomplishment while minimizing the risk to the mission and minimizing risk to the force. So it was decisive leadership, and it brought about the outcomes that we expect, which is a decisive military victory that sets the conditions for a diplomatic or political outcome.
Wonderful. I mean, I can only imagine what an honor it would be to serve under President Trump. And so thank God he's back in the seat again. Um, let's talk about Iran. That was stealth technology of them hooking up midair to refuel at hundreds of miles an hour. Tell us a little bit about that operation from your perspective, what you know about it, and why is it important to hit Iran? Because there's some concern they still have the mechanics to make a nuclear weapon and that we didn't get all of it. So what are your thoughts on all of that?
I'll start by saying I have an enormous amount of respect for the Air Force, but clearly I have a bias. I think the Marines are the best. But as I saw the debrief on this mission, it was impressive. The Air Force has extraordinary capability, and we've been sitting on this capability as a deterrent. And unfortunately, as time has passed, that deterrent had lessened. I think it was our unwillingness to use some of these extraordinary capabilities that we were losing diplomatic ground. Diplomacy works when there's a real threat of an alternative. In this case, was going to be consequences for their failure to adhere to international requirements and certainly regional concerns over how they were developing uranium. And so I think what had happened, without a doubt, President Trump saw an opportunity to leverage our extraordinary capabilities to act decisively to not only secure the region and ensure that our partners and our service members on the ground were saved, but also to reset expectations. This idea that we're no longer going to absorb what would otherwise be unacceptable escalation in the name of regional saber rattling. And I feel like what was done was an absolute picture perfect execution of extraordinary capabilities by incredible servicemen and women doing exactly what they're trained to do, which is to act decisively in an uncertain environment and effectuate an outcome that brings about a better solution. In this case, we're going to have a political or diplomatic solution without having to put boots on the ground, without having to get frustrated with regime change or nation building. We executed a military objective, and we've now set the conditions for a better outcome for everybody involved.
I love it. You know, from a civilian standpoint, for me, we've reestablished that we are the adults in the room. We've reestablished that we have leadership that will make a difference globally and is, and that we're not on an apology tour as Obama did, but we're on a mission to put everybody on equal footing. You don't get a better price on pharmaceutical than we do. We're not footing that bill anymore, right? Okay, you need to pay into NATO what your fair share is. You know, he's resetting and realigning the fairness of a global community. And you know, this whole thing with Canada, you get into the tariffs and that sort of thing. I think that I've never understood how we were so upside down on trade. I mean, it never made sense to me on that. And I'm an idiot on that. So if the basic people like myself who are going, wait, you know, why do you get to pay $1 and I have to pay 3? You know, that doesn't seem right. What are your thoughts about, first of all, is there anything more you want to say about Iran and that operation and how they struck those with the bunker busters, right? We may have a picture of that, but the way they went in and were able to so target their point. Did they get all of it? Do we know if there's more to worry about with Iran? Did we just poke the bear, or are we indeed making progress to put them in their place and frankly free the Iranian people
Yes.
because they've been under oppression since 1979.
I'll start with saying, absolutely, we made progress. There's something called battle damage assessment, and that takes time. And that will oftentimes be a classified assessment as to what was used, what was the effect of that, and then how did that change behavior on the ground? Are they simply digging out? Are they moving things away from the site? Are they bringing things into the site? So we're going to learn a lot about those sites that were hit over the next 2 or 3 months. I know there's concern that now there's a gap in our intel picture, but I'm confident that we have the capabilities at different classification levels to know exactly what's being done and why it's being done. So I think we took a decisive step to reset their capability. And there's no question that it's not just disrupted. We very well could have permanently undermined their ability to develop weapons grade plutonium. But I will provide one other anecdote about this. I've spent quite a bit of time in the Middle East, and two specific examples. I was on what's called a Marine Expeditionary Unit, which is a three-ship amphibious readiness group. And as we transited the Strait of Hormuz, we were asked to absorb a level of escalation that anywhere else in the world would have resulted in us responding in self-defense. And we allowed the Iranian boat crews to come closer to our ships than anywhere else in the world. We
Mm.
had to accept that they might have weapons trained on us, or they might be behaving in a way that was erratic. And this was part of this passive stance. And this would have been just before the first time Trump came in, President Trump. This was still under Obama. And it was unsettling to know that we're the most powerful military in the world, and we're going to go through the Strait of Hormuz with our tail between our legs. And then on my last deployment, my fifth deployment to the
So let
region,
me ask you something on that.
yeah,
Did President Obama tie your hands?
yes, there's no
Okay.
question that the
Okay.
ROE was shaped to avoid escalatory encounter. And there
So
was
you were put in a position, so I just wanted to flesh it out. You were put in a position where you were kind of sitting ducks.
sitting ducks in the sense that we were going to absorb a level of escalation that would not be tolerated anywhere else in the world. And it was because of the sensitivities around our relationship to Iran, which in essence was putting the U.S. military into the Strait of Hormuz, not as a show of power, but as a passerby, as a, hey, sorry, we're here. And I can tell you, again, my personal experience and what I observed, that was unsettling to every single person on the ship to know that there was going to be escalation to the point where we arguably wouldn't have been able to respond had they crossed that tripwire in terms of how we would defend the fleet. And that was unsettling. And then my second time dealing with Iran in different forms of leadership, my last deployment was the counter ISIS mission. And when I arrived in 2020, we were doing primarily counter ISIS cleanup in 2020. By the end of that, overwhelming majority of our planning involved Iranian aligned militia groups. So we knew they were bringing in weapons, training, and equipment that was killing our allies and partners and putting U.S. service members at risk. And we had to absorb this because it was just politics of the region. And in large part is because we were unwilling to do what needed to be done to deter that kind of nonsense on the ground. And it's refreshing to see President Trump using the tools that we have to attack a military target to set the conditions for a better outcome for the region. We can now begin the diplomatic or political process of negotiating a new treaty, of resetting expectations, but most importantly, projecting U.S. power and U.S. Capability, not in a way to run from a fight, but to say, we're going to stand here and defend our partners and allies, and we're going to defend our interest. And oh, by the way, we're going to give you an alternative to what you saw, which was an extraordinary capability that you had no defense to. We could continue this, but we're choosing to negotiate because we want to free the Iranian people from your regime. And most importantly, we want to set the conditions for peace and stability in the region.
We're going to wrap up now, Chris. How do people follow you and how do they support you? And frankly, how do people who are maybe left-leaning or registered Democrats, you're going to have a primary
Mhm.
likely, right? So Republicans need to vote for you. And if you're an independent, you really like Chris, you should register as a Republican and vote for Chris. But after all that said, and you get through the primary and we're in a general election, how are you going to appeal to Democrats who might be um, I mean, you have Democrats and military, so it's not that everybody who's
Yep.
military is a Republican, but how are you going to appeal to Democrats and have them understand that you're going to serve all the people?
Well, I think we have some key issues that we can rally around. I think the recent Supreme Court decision that transcends ideological boundaries. We want to do the best for our children. And I think we can look at parental rights and the free exercise clause, not just as a constitutional victory, but for a victory for parents. And I think that you're going to have moderate Democrats that are going to say, I have to look out for my children. Though I might feel a certain obligation to my track record of having voted Democrat over the last 10, 15, 20 years, this is too far. And then when you start looking at what John and Brenda are doing about some of the taxes and fees that were put into place this very month, it becomes very easy to make a fiscal responsibility argument that says, I'm standing for conservative values, but these are values that transcend any political ideology. We simply want accountability and integrity in our government. We expect our representatives to represent our interest and to make sure that all people have an opportunity to succeed. And how can you find any success or thrive when you're overtaxed, overregulated, and that there's absolutely no opportunity that's being created? So I would make that argument that says if you want opportunity and you want fairness, then you have to look for an alternative to Do-nothing Delaney, because she certainly is not representing your interests living in CD8 in a $4 million mansion. I'm a resident of CD6, and as a family of six who just came off active duty, we're experiencing the same struggles that many families are across Western Maryland. And that is, how do you make ends meet? How do you ensure that your children will have every opportunity that they've earned? And most importantly, how do we support law enforcement and the rule of law in a way that balances public safety?
Yeah, it's well said. I tell us, how do people follow you? How do they support you? Obviously, running a campaign like this is expensive, so you need
Yeah.
financial support as well as boots on the ground, doing volunteer, knocking on doors and so forth. How can they help?
And I appreciate that opportunity because burnettforcongress.com is where you can find all of our links for X, Truth Social, Twitter, and Instagram. And this campaign is going to live and die by our grassroots effort. I don't have a trust fund. I don't have multiple properties. I'm only going to be as effective as the support that we get across Maryland and across CD6. So if you go to that website, you can learn a little bit about my family. You can learn a little bit about my background. You can sign up for our newsletter. You can follow all those other social media sites. Over the next 60 days, I'm going to try to visit a different historic site or a regional or state or national park to provide updates and to provide some level of feedback on the status of the campaign and, most importantly, topical issues. So you can have access to all those different platforms, everything that's going on in the campaign. And then most importantly, from that website, you can access how to donate and support this grassroots campaign to ultimately make Western Maryland red again.
Wonderful. Well, listen, everybody, you've been listening to the Jen Charlton Show, telling it like it is. My guest today, Chris Burnett, is a candidate for Maryland's 6th Congressional District on the GOP ticket, and he is a veteran Marine JAG officer, a man of honor and integrity, and a dutiful and dedicated dad. So it's really great to get to know you, Chris. I'm sure that the listeners and viewers are really appreciative of your time and will step up and step in and help.